Israeli forces have been inside Gaza's main hospital for 2 days, as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his military come under growing international pressure to release proof of what they say is a Hamas command and control center in underground tunnels there. Here in the U.S., President Joe Biden agrees with Israel.
You have a circumstance where the first war crime is being committed by Hamas by having their headquarters, their military, hidden under a hospital. And that's a fact. That's what's happened.
Battles rage across the Gaza Strip, and the Hamas-run Palestinian Health Authority puts the death toll at more than 11,000, as protesters around the globe and the UN's humanitarian agency chief call for a ceasefire. After witnessing the carnage firsthand on a trip to Israel and the West Bank, New York Times columnist Tom Friedman called upon the Biden administration to come up with a two-state solution for indigenous peoples living in the areas of Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel. And it looks like the president might agree.
I made it clear to the Israelis that to Bibi and to his war cabinet that I think the only ultimate answer here is a two-state solution that's real. I'm not a fortune teller. I can't tell you how long it's going to last. But I can tell you I don't think it ultimately ends until there's a two-state solution.
Three-time Pulitzer Prize-winning author and columnist Tom Friedman joins me now to discuss. Tom, what did you see when you were in Israel?
Well, I saw a country I'd never been to before, really, Gautam, in the sense I've been visiting Israel since I was 15 and I'm now 70. But it was a traumatized country. But I think in the most important way, for purposes of this analysis, it was a country that had really been shrunken. The attack by Hamas on Israeli border towns, villages, and kibbutzim adjacent to Gaza basically had driven thousands of Israelis to leave the border area for fear that the government, the army, couldn't protect them. And at the same time, attacks by Hezbollah in Lebanon from the north along the border in support of Hezbollah, in support of Hamas, not invasions, but attacks, had prompted Israel to order an evacuation from the northern border. So you basically had these two attacks shrinking the country, pulling people toward the middle. I visited one of the kibbutzim that had been attacked by Hamas, Be'eri, and their entire community of 700 had been moved to a hotel in the Dead Sea. So that's really not a sustainable situation for any state. And but it's the huge challenge Israel's wrestling with now. You've got two enemies that are in effect shrinking the country.
So under that sort of a pressure, the Israeli government has to be thinking about how long they can maintain this situation, how long they can keep 300,000 reserves mobilized, even as their military objectives aren't finished in Gaza. So do they have a sense there's a ticking clock? And if so, how much time is left on it?
There's certainly a ticking clock. And during the time I was there, I heard a whole different set of time frames. I mean, some people, Defense Minister Gallant has really talked about a project that would take 6 months that would take the Israeli army through Gaza City, which it's taken now all the way down to Khan Yunis and the border with Egypt. Other people told me we may only have 3 more weeks. We'll stay in the north of Gaza, use that as a platform to try to take on the Hamas leadership to the south. There was not at least in the time I was there, a very clear sense of how much time they had or what the ultimate goal would be other than their goal, they said, of destroying Hamas.
So destroying Hamas without sort of a years-long occupation of the Gaza Strip strikes me as something approaching an impossibility. So what is their victory condition? What is it that they're looking for to get out of this?
You know, again, Gautam, there is no consistent presentation of that. You heard Prime Minister Netanyahu last weekend saying that there'll be basically no Palestinian Authority from the West Bank taking over Gaza. It will remain under Israeli control, in essence, for perpetuity. But given the fact that Israel is also controlling 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank, that would mean 2 million more in Gaza. You're talking about 7 million Jews controlling 5 million Palestinians. And I don't think that's sustainable. I think President Biden doesn't think that's sustainable. It requires a Palestinian partner. But I think we can't even have that conversation until obviously we know where this war ends and how it ends.
And so, I mean, every war must end, but they can go on for a very long time. what is Israeli society going to look like after 3 months, 6 months of this, if that's what they're thinking about doing?
Well, one of my concerns all along, Gautam, is been built on some research by Israeli economist Dan Ben-David, who basically argues that Israel is a country of 7 million, but there's about 400,000 Israelis in key positions of economics, of research, of medicine, of technology, of military. And they're the bus that, they're the ones who drive the whole bus, those 400,000. And I believe one of the overt or tacit goals of Hezbollah and Hamas has been try to get those 400,000, many of them, to leave. And because they're talented people, many have dual passports. So they're trying to do it by design. I think Netanyahu is trying to do it by default. That is by pushing for a judicial coup, by giving ridiculous amounts of money to ultra-Orthodox parties that don't teach their kids math, science, English, or civics, democratic civics, by funding more and more settlement of the West Bank and creating conflict and tension there. He's also eroding the number of that key 400,000. Obviously, lots of Israelis and lots of talent, but that key that really makes the difference. And that's what I worry about in the long run. It's a small country, and it's a relatively small, tip of the spear there. And I think that's one of the real long-term threats for Israel.
So the Israeli political debate with regards to the war is strikingly in some ways wider than the American one, where you see Netanyahu facing direct criticism in Israeli politics and from Israeli society in a way that there's not a lot of from the American political equivalents in the U.S. Is that going to, that does not seem sustainable, his war leadership, when he's running at 10 or 15% in the Israeli polls. Are we going to see turnover in the Israeli government? Are we going to see the U.S. pushing for that turnover?
I would distinguish between support for the war right now against Hamas and getting revenge for the killing of 1,200 Israeli citizen soldiers, the abduction of 240. That seems to be pretty broadly supported. What is not supported is who's going to lead the country the morning after. And anyone who's been in Israel for the last few weeks will tell you there is a welling anger there, waiting to explode against Netanyahu if and when the fighting stops, and particularly if and when the 300 or 400,000 reservists return from the front. And so, again, Netanyahu has been a very deft politician. I wouldn't write his obit myself, a political obit right now, but I think you're going to see an explosion of rage directed at him and his cabinet. People like Yariv Levin, the justice minister, who forced through this judicial coup at a time when the Shin Bet security service, military intelligence, the army leadership said, you're breaking the army because we have pilots who refuse to fly for a dictatorship. And not only are you breaking the army, they told him, Hamas and Hezbollah are noticing it. They're talking about it. They're seeing us as vulnerable. And so I think when the commission of inquiry happens after this war, that's something that's going to come out very prominently. So I don't know what's going to happen to Netanyahu. All I know is, as I've argued in my piece, I believe he's the worst leader in Israeli history, possibly the worst leader in Jewish history. He fractured Israel at exactly the wrong time. And, for my money, the sooner he leaves the political scene, the more chance Israel can come together, because Netanyahu's whole style of leadership, he and Trump are brothers from different mothers. It's the same thing. It's divide and rule. Try to win by 50.0001%. Divide, divide, divide. Jews from Arabs, religious from secular, Ashkenazim from Sephardim. That's been his whole approach since he began, and it's done terrible damage to Israeli society and its politics.
So then, on the Palestinian side, the killing in the West and the Gaza Strip is getting worse by the day. Are we starting to see fraying among Hamas ranks? Any sense that they are reaching out to any kind of negotiations?
Good question. There's just so little of that kind of reporting, Gautam. It's not like you can talk to the Hamas leadership, but it does appear Israel's pretty well taken control of Gaza City. So if you think of Gaza as thirds, there's Gaza City up to the Gaza River. Then you move south, there's an area of refugee camps, and now huge number. I don't know the exact number, but hundreds of thousands and maybe a million refugees. And then the third part, up closer to the Egyptian border, is Khan Yunis, where the Hamas leadership is believed to be hiding. And so the question really is now for Israel, do you try to go all the way to the south, try to do to Khan Yunis what you did to Gaza City? By the way, that would be tragic. The city's now uninhabitable. What do you do with all those refugees in between? And that's why you've seen this thing slow down a little bit. There's talk of an imminent hostage exchange, but we've heard that it's imminent now for days. So I don't know what's going on there. I'm sure Israel has made a lot of mistakes, and they're going to reflect on this, for a long time. But no one's made a bigger mistake than the Hamas leadership that's exposed itself and the Palestinian cause in ways that, and most of all, the civilians of Gaza to an Israeli retaliation that was expected, totally predictable, and it's just done. It's been a tragedy for the people of Gaza, who I think are as much have been as much taken hostage by Hamas all these years as Hamas has taken hostages from Israel.
So the situation in the Gaza Strip is the worst, but things are also getting worse in the West Bank, where we're seeing settlers sort of really putting a lot of pressure on Palestinians in that area. Do we see that going to be continuing? How bad is it likely to get? And is the Israeli government going to take steps to stop it?
Well, there's a real worry. There are radical settlers there who are actually trying to create a conflict there with Palestinians in hopes of widespread violence that would get Israel to push them out and across the Jordan. That sounds perverse, but it is their agenda. And so that's very worrying to me, how that's going to be quelled. But these people are politically Bibi Netanyahu's base. His only hope of staying in power is by depending on these radical settler Jewish supremacist groups. And, American Jews don't understand. You didn't go to Jewish summer camp with these people. They weren't in the cabin in the Catskills next to you, and they were not on your last UJA or birthright tour. These are radical, extremist, Jewish supremacists who look like they just walked out of the Second Temple, and they're dangerous. But there's also Hamas elements in the West Bank too. This is there's no love fest going on there, so all of it's highly unstable, and I have no idea how it's going to play out.
And then, sort of the worst case scenario for Israel would be more involvement from Hezbollah or even from Iran. What are we seeing in terms of efforts to stop the war from spreading out to bringing them in on full scale?
Everything kind of changes day to day, Gautam, but what's been interesting is after a pretty intense back and forth between Israel and Hezbollah letting Hamas elements in southern Lebanon, so a lot of Palestinian refugee camps there, also fire rockets and drones at Israel. In the last 48 hours, it seems to have calmed down. There is I think a sense, literally as we sit here today, that Iran has decided that it does not want to expose its Hezbollah sort of second strike capability to complete devastation by Israel, and is going to keep this under control. We have 2 American aircraft carriers in the region right now, Gautam, if you think about it, one in the Eastern Mediterranean, one now just getting positioned in the Persian Gulf near Iran. And Iran has 4 aircraft carriers. I call them landcraft carriers. Hezbollah, the Houthis in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and Shiite militias in Iraq. So these are all platforms, just like an aircraft carrier is a platform, and Iran uses them to project power in the region in its larger goal of driving America and Western influence out of the area. And again, I think if you step back, this is a point I've been making since the start of the war. If you look at this from 30,000 feet, what's been going on in the world is basically that Ukraine was trying to join the West and Israel was trying to join the East. Israel was trying to join the East in the sense of normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia, which would have been a giant change in the region, as big, if not bigger, than the Egyptian-Israeli peace at Camp David. Russia is trying to prevent Ukraine from joining the West. Iran is trying to prevent Israel from joining the East with now the help of Hamas, et cetera. And now Iran and Russia are actually fused as partners in both projects in many ways.